me. And I can tell you right now that it is exhausting trying to be man enough for everyone all the time.
It looks like this case is far from over and could stretch on for several weeks. There were people inside the courtroom during the pre-hearing, and now we're getting a clearer picture of what actually happened. From what's been discussed, there's still a lot up in the air, and honestly, it feels like almost anything could happen at this point. After reviewing everything, the big question seems to be about the length of the trial. Initially, it sounded like it might last around 6 weeks, but that's not exactly the case. What was actually requested were 15 trial days from Blake Lively's side and another 15 from Justin's, which could bring the total to about 30 days. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it will go that long. It really depends on how much the judge decides to narrow things down. A major factor in that decision is whether the judge dismisses the FIHA claims. If those claims are removed, then the case would essentially come down to a breach of contract issue, which is much more straightforward and easier to prove. In that scenario, the trial would likely be shorter. On the other hand, if FIHA remains, then Blake Lively would be able to argue that she had a valid reason for filing her complaint, that it counts as a protected activity, and that she faced retaliation because of it. That would open the door to a much broader range of evidence and arguments, potentially stretching the trial to the full length. The timing of how these legal arguments were presented has also become a point of tension. There's a strong argument that the California-based claims should have been challenged much earlier in the process instead, by waiting until later in the case. It created a situation where the judge now has to decide whether to resolve the issue as a matter of law, or let a jury sort through the facts. That balancing act is complicating things and making the outcome less predictable. Another moment that caught attention during the hearing involved a controversial video. Blake Lively's team wants it sealed, while Justin's team is strongly against that idea. The judge indicated that, generally, both sides will need to make their evidence available to the public as the trial progresses. This means that at some point, the video could become public anyway. The disagreement over whether it should be sealed has sparked a lot of speculation about what it actually shows and how significant it really is. There was also discussion around financial claims, particularly regarding alleged lost profits. Blake Lively's team is arguing that the value of her business ventures dropped significantly and that this should count as damages. However, the opposing side pushed back, saying those losses are speculative and don't directly translate into money out of her pocket, since she isn't receiving direct payouts tied to those valuations. They argue it's difficult to prove a real financial loss. The judge appeared to be weighing these arguments carefully, especially given how large and uncertain the claimed damages are. Overall, the hearing didn't settle anything definitively, but it did highlight just how complex and uncertain this case has become, with key decisions still pending and multiple legal angles in play. The direction this trial takes could shift significantly depending on what the judge decides next. From my perspective, that argument probably shouldn't be allowed in at all, and it's easy to see why it raised eyebrows in the courtroom. Another major issue that came up was Blake Lively's team trying to introduce claims about Steve Sowitz's Allegedly having access to $100 million and suggesting he could use that financial power to aggressively pursue legal action against her. Their goal seemed to be to paint a picture of imbalance to show the jury that Blake Lively was up against someone with significant resources and influence, which could make her actions appear more reasonable or justified under pressure. However, that strategy immediately opened the door for the other side to respond in kind. Justin Baldoni's team argued that if wealth and financial standing are going to be used as part of the narrative, then it would only be fair to examine the financial position of Blake Lively's own household, including how much Ryan Reynolds is worth. That kind of counter-argument highlights the risk of introducing wealth into a case like this. It can quickly spiral and shift the focus away from the actual legal issues and toward a comparison of who has more money, which isn't supposed to be the point of a trial. Because of that, it seems very likely that the judge will exclude those kinds of arguments altogether. Courts generally try to avoid letting financial status influence a jury unless it's directly relevant, and here it feels more like a strategic narrative tool than a necessary piece of evidence. On top of that, the damages being claimed by Blake Lively's side are already under scrutiny for being too speculative. They're attempting to tie alleged actions to large-scale financial losses across various business ventures, but the connection isn't clearly defined. Just because the value of a brand or company fluctuates doesn't automatically mean it was caused by the opposing party. And without concrete proof, those numbers can start to look inflated or uncertain. That uncertainty makes it harder to justify presenting them as solid damages. This ties directly into another important development: the possibility of splitting the trial into two separate phases. In many complex cases, courts will first focus entirely on liability, essentially determining whether the defendant is actually responsible for wrongdoing. Only if that is proven does the trial move into a second phase where damages are calculated. In this situation, that approach seems increasingly likely. If the judge decides to structure the trial this way, it would significantly limit what Blake Lively's team can present in the initial phase. A lot of the detailed discussion about her brands, endorsements, and product lines, things like her hair care ventures or other business interests, would likely be set aside unless she first succeeds in proving her core claims. That could dramatically narrow the scope of the trial, at least in its early stages. When it comes to timing, the uncertainty is still a big issue. Technically, the judge has the authority to make these decisions very close to the start of the trial, even just days before, but doing so would create logistical challenges for both sides. They've been asked to narrow down their exhibit lists and estimate how long the trial will take. But those estimates depend heavily on what arguments and evidence will actually be allowed. Without clear rulings on key issues like FIHA claims or damages, both teams are essentially trying to prepare while aiming at a moving target. Normally, these types of legal questions would have been resolved much earlier in the process, well before this stage. However, in this case, the sheer volume of filings and the pace at which new arguments have been introduced seem to have delayed that clarity. Even so, the judge has acknowledged this and stated that he's actively working through the pending motions, which suggests that decisions are coming, it's just a matter of when. Toward the end of the hearing, there was also a particularly surprising moment involving jury selection. Blake Lively's team appeared to suggest that potential jurors might not be entirely neutral, raising the possibility that some of them could have been indirectly involved in the alleged smear campaign through social media activity. That implication seemed to catch the opposing side off guard, especially since it hadn't been a central argument earlier in the case. The idea that everyday social media users could be considered participants in the controversy is a bold claim, and it didn't seem to resonate strongly in the courtroom. The judge acknowledged that the case has attracted public attention, but also pointed out the reality that almost everyone uses social media in some form, making it impractical to exclude jurors on that basis alone. What Blake Lively's team was really pushing for was a more controlled jury selection process. They wanted to use detailed written questionnaires to screen potential jurors in advance, asking what they've heard about the case, what opinions they might already hold, and even whether they have preferences or biases toward the individuals involved. While that approach can sometimes be used in high-profile cases, the judge ultimately rejected it here, choosing not to allow that level of pre-screening. That decision suggests he's aiming to keep the process more standard and manageable, rather than expanding it based on speculative concerns about social media influence. Overall, this portion of the hearing underscored just how many moving pieces there are in this case. From arguments about wealth and damages to procedural questions about how the trial will be structured and how jurors will be selected, very little has been firmly settled. Each decision the judge makes from here could significantly shape not only the length of the trial but also the strategies both sides are able to use once it begins. And the judge essentially explained his reasoning by saying he prefers doing things in person because you can pick up a lot more from someone face-to-face than you ever could from a written questionnaire. His view was that in-person questioning gives a clearer sense of credibility, behavior, and how people respond under pressure, whereas written answers are too easy to prepare, filter, or even manipulate. So from that perspective, he rejected the idea of a simple checklist-style questionnaire that would basically ask jurors something like, "Do you like Blake Lively? Yes or no? Check a box." That's the kind of overly simplified screening process one side was pushing for. And the judge clearly wasn't interested in reducing jury selection to that level. Instead, he made it clear that he wants real conversation with potential jurors in court, where lawyers and the judge can actually observe how they respond in real time, not just what they write down on paper. From there, the discussion shifted to reactions from people who were actually in the courtroom. And Kim raised an important question about the overall atmosphere. She basically asked what the vibe was like inside, whether the judge seemed to be leaning toward one side, whether there was any noticeable frustration or bias, or if everything still felt neutral. It's a fair question in a high-profile case like this, where every small reaction from the bench gets analyzed. Rick responded first, explaining that it's actually quite difficult to read Judge Lyman consistently because he tends to question both sides evenly. According to him, that pattern hasn't really changed throughout the hearings, and the judge maintains a fairly controlled and neutral courtroom presence. However, Rick did note that today felt different in terms of energy. He felt that the Wayfarer team came in much more prepared and more aggressive compared to the previous hearing, describing them as more on fire in how they presented their arguments. He also pointed out differences in style between the attorneys. One lawyer, he noted, is extremely careful and measured with their words, slow, deliberate, and precise, while another is much more forceful and direct in delivery. The kind of speaker who hits hard and doesn't waste time. That contrast in courtroom styles seemed to shape how the arguments landed. Rick admitted he didn't even hear one of the key attorneys speak that day because he arrived about an hour late. But from what he observed, the Wayfarer side simply came across as more confident and sharper in their presentation overall. Carol added to that perspective, focusing more on how structured and disciplined the arguments were. She explained that one of the attorneys actually managed their time very carefully during a 15-minute segment, even setting aside a portion of it specifically for rebuttal. Interestingly, the judge ended up giving them additional time anyway. even though they hadn't fully used what they originally requested. Her impression was that the arguments were short, controlled, and very direct, with no unnecessary stretching or emotional overreach. In contrast to earlier hearings, she felt the presentation today was more focused and efficient, with less wandering and more precision in how points were made. She also raised the possibility that the judge is leaning toward which would split the trial into two distinct phases. First, determining liability, and only if that is established. Moving on to damages. In simple terms, bifurcation means separating the question of did Blake Lively win her case from how much money, if any, should she receive. According to Carol, Judge Lyman seemed open to this structure, and she suggested that it actually makes practical sense given the complexity of the evidence. Under that structure, evidence related to damages such as expert reports about lost opportunities, business impact, or potential earnings from projects like sequels or directing opportunities would only be introduced if Blake Lively first wins the liability phase. Otherwise, that material would never reach the jury. Carol explained that Blake Lively's team would likely prefer to present everything together, including financial losses and reputational harm, to build a broader narrative. But the defense is pushing to keep damages separate to prevent the jury from being influenced by large financial figures before even deciding fault.